Brian and George will take us through. We got
Thank
the
you,
recording
Chair
going.
McDonough. Appreciate it. This is, I believe, our third annual report out on the Ramsey County Transit portfolio status, as well as our current financial projections. Public Works Director Ted Schenecker is prioritizing labor negotiations this afternoon. So we are going to be in the very capable hands of Brian Isaacson, the Deputy Director of Public Works, or a Deputy Director of Public Works, I should say more accurately, and George Hardgrove, the EGCI Controller. So Brian, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Commissioners. It's always a pleasure to be with you. It's a nice way to bring in the cold weather to start talking to you about large numbers and transit projects. This is our third annual view of the transit work program, and I just wanted to take a moment to reflect on, I know the arc of these projects is long, and sometimes these projects are daunting, but I appreciate the level of commitment and support and optimism that the board has shown towards these projects as they do take time and energy to execute. So I just wanted to start by offering that. So today, our goal is to walk through the overall program, talk about some of the key assumptions that we're making, update the financial picture for you and talk about where that stands, and then talk about any updates there are to the overall program and some of the challenges and opportunities we see going forward. And the main goal, of course, is to make sure that we're still tracking in the right direction relative to what the board's desires are for the overall work program. Next slide, George. So again, we are in a good position to be able to say that financially speaking, we're in good shape. We can afford the program of projects. And actually, we can dive into the details of it later, but the short version is the picture has improved a little bit, both in terms of the timing and the bonding of projects. We're still relatively close, and an interesting takeaway of this is that the financial picture for this overall program is fairly sensitive. And so minor changes in assumptions, both either on the revenue side or on the cost side, can make a difference in terms of the timing of bonding and the overall, call it the financial health of the program. But we're in good shape today based on what we know, and we'll talk about where the rest of the program is and what kinds of things are potential challenges and opportunities. Thank you, George. So this year has been a year of some major milestones. I'll highlight a couple that Gold Line is now at 100% of design, which means they're essentially finished and preparing the project for construction, which is a huge milestone. And I know, having worked on this in another agency and worked alongside friends at Ramsey in Washington, that this has had many years of work go into it, and that's a huge milestone to reach. We're also excited to say the Purple Line is entering the federal transit program, and that's another big milestone for that project as it transitions to the putting Met Council in the leadership role of the project. There have been some other things that are within the transit portfolio. We've had some success in seeing what's termed the G line. So in the arterial BRT program that the council is developing, they've determined that the next, it would be the G line would be a couple of years out, but they're about to allocate some federal funds to that project and declare that as within the funded program that Met Council has for ABRT. And then we had some success with the second train. We still have work to do there, but that the second train from Chicago is another big win for us in this year, even to the point of seeing a plan come through the Federal Rail Authority declaring that the depot is the second largest passenger rail hub in the Midwest. second only to Chicago, and the vision for that is to see a lot more trains come through the depot. So I think overall it's been a good year for us. And in the midst of all of our folks that work on these projects have been in the remote setting the entire time. I think that they've done an amazing job of keeping things moving and staying connected to all of our partners and all of our residents that have been engaged in projects and continuing to meet these milestones head on. So I can't say enough about the work that our folks have done to keep things moving. So in terms of major project assumptions, not a lot has changed here. I think what we can say is that we're still assuming that all three projects are operational by 2032. Of course, they happen in stages, where Gold Line would be open in 2025. Purple Line is anticipated to be open for operation in 26, and Riverview is planned for 2032. We, of course, assume that we have partners in these projects, and whether it's federal partners or state partners in the council or our county partners, that they are participating in the projects, both actively engaged in delivering the projects, but also planning for their shares of the projects and delivering those when they're needed. Another key component that is an important assumption, as I mentioned, because the financial model is somewhat sensitive to costs and revenues, we've been fairly conservative in terms of how we've looked at both ridership estimates and things like fare box recovery. And so we've used industry standards based on where things are at today to make sure that we're not too far out ahead of where the data would allow us to declare things. And those are just important to recognize, and we'll talk a little bit more about how some of those have potentially been impacted over time in upcoming slides. So I would put the risks into two buckets here. One, I would say that there's more of the philosophical risks, and then there are more of the logistical risks. And an example of a logistical risk is that, based on experiences around the country, FTA is now requiring that proponents of projects fund a secondary contingency. So major projects, the FTA projects have always had a pretty substantial contingency built within the total project budget. And as you see in the reference slides toward the end of the presentation, those numbers include that contingency. What FTA is now requiring is that project proponents have another contingency just in case. And we have a local example in Southwest in that they've had to both burn through their planned contingency as well as their secondary contingency. So that's more of a logistical risk. The philosophical risks are more along the lines of how people are perceiving the viability or the value of transit in their life. And it's, that's directly related to COVID. And I think that it even gets to points of whether people perceive that there is congestion that transit helps with. There are certainly, we hear a lot about perceived security issues, and we hear a lot about thoughts about where people are really going now, in terms of whether they're really going to downtowns or whether they're going to other places. I will say that based on my understanding of the current information in terms of congestion, what we're seeing around the region is that the morning peak period is not what it was before COVID. It is less intense and it is later. And the evening peak period is more like what we've experienced in the past in terms of congestion and travel time issues. And so I think that it's a question of who the folks are that we're hearing from, and again, echoes the importance that this board has impressed upon us as project staff, that that's where engagement really matters. So we really understand who all the folks are that need it and what their perceptions are relative to the project. Okay. So in terms of challenges and opportunities, we mentioned a little bit about, we've talked a little bit about COVID impacts, but I think we've seen that just recently, Met Council had announced that they were going to reduce service, which certainly has a resident impact, and that is attributable both to a shortage of drivers. They're having a significant shortage of drivers, and they're working hard to try to address that, but also less riders. And I think we see that overall transit ridership is still significantly down. I think what we can say with some optimism is that things like BRT are not as hard hit in terms of their ridership. They tend to be more like 65% of the pre-COVID ridership. So they're only down about a third or a little bit more, whereas the trains are down a little bit more than that. And then general bus service falls lower even than that. Probably more significant issues are around the master operating funding agreement, and you all certainly will recall the excitement we had last session in terms of negotiating with Met Council on our master operating funding agreement. I think what we're seeing now in the results of that improved discussion are we're seeing that they have costs that they hadn't anticipated, and they're looking for ways to fund that. We've been working with them, and this tends to play itself out in terms of other agreements. But some of the costs that they're experiencing is they're trying to engage in improved security around transit stations and on transit routes, and so they've been working to hire what had in some bills been called the ambassador program, but it's essentially non-licensed peace officers to try to improve the feelings of security on a number of the routes. I think that they're seeing maintenance costs grow, and they, like many employers around the region, are having trouble hiring, whether it's for mechanics or bus drivers or a number of other things. And so they're trying to develop creative programs like a training program or apprentice programs where they're bringing people into the workforce that haven't typically thought about them as an employment opportunity. Before we jump into the financial implications, you can go ahead to the next slide, George, but I just want to take a pause and see if anybody had any questions before we move on to the financial pieces.
I don't see any hands raised.
Okay. George, do you want to address the next slide?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, and good afternoon, Chair McDonough and commissioners. Yeah, it's good to see you again this afternoon and everything. Yeah, as Brian had mentioned, we ran the numbers again. You know, at this point in the year, we have seen some improvement in our ability, the Ramsey County's ability to finance these projects. As we said before, you know, just to go over the first bullet point, the first between now and 2033, the next 11-12 years or so, we're still, you know, we still need to use all funds available to finance these projects, but we're really seeing the improvements is really kind of after that, after 2033, when hopefully the Riverview corridor is done. We'll still need most of the funds to pay the debt service, but the debt service amounts that we've calculated that we need have gone down somewhat. One of the main reasons that I would say that it's really better is really the RRA tax. When we were a year ago or so, when last time we talked to the board about these projects, you know, we were still pretty fearful that the pandemic was going to cause some major possible major recessions and a downturn in demand, and it turned out to really be, at least through now, more of a V-shaped recovery. It did come back pretty fast, so we were able to raise our RRA tax estimates about a couple $1 million a year. We have been working around 25, 27 million a year ago, and now we're up to about 27 to 30 million or so, just based on kind of what's happened. And so we've kind of upped our, come a little bit more optimistic on the RRA tax, especially. And even though that doesn't, sound like much when you're just talking 2 to 3 million a year, but when this ripples through the model over 30 years of time or so, it does actually become quite significant. And of course, the less debt we have to finance and the less interest we have to pay too, which certainly helps. It helps. That it helps in that regard as well too. The transit tax was a little bit better than we thought too. We were putting that in the range of, especially that we were pretty fearful may go down, and it didn't go down quite as much as we thought. And so we were able to raise our estimates, at least in the first few years here in the near term, by a couple million, about $1 million or two a year or so too on that. So that's really the primary reason why things got better. There is some more minor things, like we received a little bit more contributions from the federal government. Some of the costs have gone down a little bit here, not major, but more so the revenue. So getting back to the slide, like I say, from 2033 to 2058, the debt is, that will take the most of our cash flow, but there may be some opportunities, especially if we get out of that reserve, that 10% special contingency we were required to carry. Once those projects are done, then we won't need to carry that anymore too. So that helps as well too. And then finally, the debt service is paid off in 2058 is what our projection, which is pretty similar to a year ago. But the debt did overall go down. Like say a year ago, we were projecting we were going to need about 690 million in county debt, with another 70 million pledged against the RRA. Now we were able to reduce the county debt down to 445 million through a couple of debt issues, and then the RRA debt at around 65 million for 8 years or so. The terms are roughly the same. One issue I think on the county debt is for 25 years, and then the other one is for 30 years. So more to come there. We do want to go back to Baker Tilly at some point too soon, and we've been collaborating with Washington County and things on some of the things they're doing to finance the gold line on. So we'll go back there soon and probably try to run some more sophisticated models, to hopefully get it down, and we'll certainly pay close attention to the revenues coming in as well too. So that's really kind of the, in summary, I guess, kind of where we're at right now in terms of being able to finance these projects. So with that, I think I can turn it back to Brian now for our next slide.
Thanks, George. Hold on to that slide for a second, though. I think George references a couple of things. And so as we think about the finances, I think next year we'll be coming to you with some other actions. I think it's pretty clear that George has it well in hand, and that it's a fairly complex model that we've built. But I think that there are some, as we near construction, both on, Gold Line is certainly imminent, but Purple Line is not that far away either. As we get into the details of that, we'll start to have some actions that will come to you as a board, right, George?
Yeah, no, that's right, Brian. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah. I think the first actions will be kind of declaring, certain projects as being eligible for tax exempt funding. That's, I think, the first actions which I do think we'll want to bring forward. We don't need to bond, super soon or anything. We got a few years out, but we do want to make sure that, the construction part of these projects are eligible, to be bonded against. So that's probably the first thing we'll come back with.
Great. Thanks, George.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So in sum, we're moving those projects forward. It takes up all of our money for the next 12 years. And then we have a little bit of breathing room after that, but we still have a considerable amount of obligation and debt. And so that leaves us with very little breathing room to do much else. And yet there are still lots of other things happening in the region. And so we put this slide together to give a sense for what are some of the things that are going on and what are our typical roles in those things. So when it comes to arterial BRT, we are definitely part of the advocacy, and I think we've seen that that's had a lot of success, both with, I think we had a couple of commissioners that were engaged in advocating for both B-line and D-line bonding, as well as advocating for, within the Met Council's planning process, for the G-line to become one of the next ones to be funded. And so that'll continue to be our role. Of course, a lot of arterial BRT end up on county roads, and so that ends up being part of our role too, that Public Works, as well as our staff on the rail authority, are actively engaged in trying to navigate what types of improvements are made and how they connect to the overall network that we're trying to develop. When you see things like the second train and the freight connections, again, those are advocacy and planning partner roles where we're advocating for things. As an example, the second train from Chicago is going to need funding for its operating going forward. There is a federal grant that reduces that number dramatically for the first 3 years, but there is still a local share that needs to be identified, and there is the share that needs to be funded once the federal grant is expended. There are things like the Highway 36 transit study, where we're basically partnering and offering our thoughts on how some of our partner counties' ideas that are developing connect with our work and what sorts of thoughts we have relative to priorities. And then there are things like the Blue Line Riverview connection, which was an outgrowth of the Riverview work that had happened a few years back. And it's an important exercise to go through so that we can help identify what types of transit service would connect between our planned Riverview line and then the existing Blue Line.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a question on this point, or do you want to hold on questions?
Go ahead, Mary Jo. We're here.
Just a quick one, because I see our strategic roles in these areas, and I'm most familiar with the Highway 36 transit study. So we're planning partner in this one, and then the next, most of the others. At some point, are they going to ask us for money in any of these, or if it's in our area, we'll be paying for it? Like I'm just familiar with the 36 study. Like if we do decide to put a stop on Rice Street, which is Ramsey County, then we would pay for that. We're just a planning partner now, but it might turn into a funding partner at some point for our part of it. Am I thinking of these correctly?
So I'm going to give you a Weasley answer, and I don't intend for it to be as Weasley as it sounds, but it kind of depends. So the highway BRT is a little bit of a different animal in that who pays for things, both on the capital and the operating, is a little different. Okay. And it doesn't tend to look like some of the other ones that we're more familiar with. And so right now, highway BRT is something that the state actually pays for operating on. And so if you look at Red Line, you could call that a highway BRT. The Orange Line is a little bit of a different animal too, in that went up through a federal process. And so a lot of that station work was paid for through those grants. I don't recall how much local partners paid for, because that was part of other work. So it's a little bit of a complicated picture, my apologies, but I wouldn't, for one, I think it would be a ways off. And for another, there would be a number of studies. If you imagine some of the work that we've done in the past, this would be maybe when Ramsey and Washington County were working on Gold Line in the mid 2000s. And so I think you're quite a ways out from seeing construction happening in any event, but I think that, that could evolve differently too. So I hope that it helps.
Thank you. No, that does help. Thank you. Thank you for reframing my mind on whose project that really is. That's right. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So if you could advance to the next slide, George, I'd appreciate it. So the last point I wanted to make is when we look at, we've had a couple of conversations, and I'll say we're relatively early on in trying to figure out how we work together on this, but we've been talking with our friends at CED and housing about how do we do things together so that we're more focused and we can help optimize the investments that we're making on the transportation system in places where it's going to help both economic development as well as helping to reduce the overall cost burden for living in particular areas. And we know that when you have more transit options, you tend to have a lower cost of living because you've got different ways to get to where you need to go. And so just referencing these bullets here, there are going to be critical corridors around the county where we'll have to think about how we best connect the dots relative to our transit work and the efforts on the CED and housing side. We do a fair amount of work on development reviews and working with our partners to be thoughtful about where they focus their energies, and if there are ways when we're reviewing plats and developments that they can be more supportive of transit, we encourage those folks at that stage. And then as we think about in the coming year, what types of things we might work on, we've been talking about developing a transportation plan update. And that would be a place where we could start to really put some meat on the bones of this idea of how do we frame connecting transit and housing and economic development issues so that we're really all pulling in the right direction. So just wanting to be clear that we understand the need for this and that it has a great impact on our residents.
All right. Thank you for that. I'm looking here. Any questions or comments from commissioners? I just wanted to maybe frame up a couple of key takeaways. I think, getting a report back here to the board to reaffirm that financially we can still continue to have confidence that we have the ability to meet current and future commitments. The current commitments around the green line and our operating commitments, and future commitments on Gold Line, Purple Line, and Riverview, both capital and operating, between the sales tax and the regional rail property tax levy. That's always good to know, and we need to continue to make sure that we're paying attention to that, because the pencil has to be sharp. I mean, we knew from day one when we moved forward with our program of projects that we literally were spending every penny we had for the next 30 or so years, and continue to validate that. George, I think some good news this year. There's a little bit of movement that actually is to the positive for us, but nothing that we can start spending money on, and we need to have restraint here because this is a long-term vision that we need to be prepared for. It takes a long time to put these forward. And then the piece here, I think that we're all aware of, and it will always continue to be the risk, is we have a local pot of money that by statute or commitment or MOUs is committed and is a part of our share in helping fund a regional transit system. But that when you have that local pot of money, it's always attractive to other folks, and that we're always going to be at risk of other folks wanting to either determine how we spend that money or try to capture that money for their own use. And we've seen some of that this year with the governor's proposal. We were able to fend that off, but mostly a lot of the reasons why we're able to protect what we have is because of the work that you guys do in helping us provide the data on the fact is that we are not flush with money here, that yes, there is a pot of money, but no, for us to be able to complete the triangle with the blue line, the green line, and Riverview, we need to be able to have every penny we have to honor our capital and operating commitments. So appreciate your work here to help support us and continuing to move these lines forward. I think it's always important for us to see where we partner and where our partnership is helping to advocate, because our residents depend on a robust transit system that has all modes, and we have a funding commitment for some of those modes that gives us a different perspective and interest in those lines. But the other modes are just as important to our residents and just as important to the lines that we actually financially participate in, because for this to succeed, it has to be a robust, interconnected system of all modes that work well together. So I do see a few heads that have popped up now, so I'm just going to go right down the list. We'll go to Commissioner Mattis-Castillo, Commissioner Reinhardt, and then Commissioner McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Brian, for a great presentation. I'm just wondering, because earlier we had our legislative committee team of the whole this morning. And as we're thinking about these discussions and who leads on projects and what priorities we have, just to make sure that we're coordinating there with the legislative team and moving those together, and that we're not working separately. As even looking at, for instance, advocating for ongoing resources for the Great River Rail or second train or third or fourth or fifth, whatever might be proposed, thinking about how we're putting those priorities together as well as the other lines, because I think you're right. We've worked really hard to get additional BRT lines and we serve on the tab, but we want to make sure that we're have the seat at the table at the Capitol as well, and to make sure we're coordinating. So just wanted to raise that up. Thanks very much for all your work on this and the whole team.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. And Mr. Chair, if I could respond just briefly.
Go ahead.
Commissioner Mattis-Castillo, I appreciate that sentiment. And I do think that one outgrowth of what was a challenging spring and that relationship, call it strain, is that I really think that we have a lot more attention and there's a lot more intentionality between Met Council and Met Transit and us as a county. And I think that we've seen both a little bit of a turn towards that from Met Council, and there's been some staff changes too, which are helping that as well. And so I think that partnership is developing. Those are, of course, long-term relationships that are going to be important, and those will help us navigate some of the priority challenges.
Mr. Chair, if I may just quickly add on the same topic, I also think that we should think about where we add these priorities to our federal legislative package. One of the things that has frustrated me for a really long time, especially around transit, is that we use the ridership quotient to whether or not you get transit funded, which to me is never going to get us to our goals, our environmental goals, our transit goals, if we're always looking at ridership first. And it's the old adage of we don't build a bridge based on how many people are swimming across the river, right? We want to make sure that we're building transit and make it more convenient so that people use it. And so I'm wondering if there's a place that we think about taking a strong role in advocacy about helping to flip that narrative and building a coalition around, we need to build transit because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing long-term, and that ridership can't drive that necessarily as the key leading factor. So just something to add to that thought.
Absolutely.
Yep. Well said.
Yeah.
All right. Commissioner Reinhardt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate this presentation as well. I want to get into some nitty gritty here, and that's specifically about the Purple Line. There's been, we recently had elections, and there was a lot of rhetoric, a lot of false information that was out there. And there's, not a whole lot we can do about other than trying to educate people. But I have to tell you that I am concerned because one of the questions that has come up, and even in your presentation, we talk about it, and that is on bus lines that the pandemic has had a marked decrease in ridership. And so when you talk about a bus line, and I'm talking specifically about the Purple Line, if there's 30% less ridership today than there was when we brought this forward, it's a question that people that may not actually be their issue, but that's what they can glom onto. As far as, well, is it really needed? Are you going to have that kind, the kind of ridership? And I am wondering, because legitimately we should have the facts before everyone, and this is transitioning to the Metropolitan Council. But is there something where we can be specifically related to COVID? And I don't know if it's needed on the gold line, but I mean, we know what these lines are like, no matter where you go across the country and across our region, where we could make it clear that those numbers are reevaluated at each phase of this project. We know that, but that if we don't have something that we can point to that says, well, this is what we, in the evaluation now, we're not past COVID yet, so it's kind of hard to say what's going to happen there. But there are so many, and again, I don't think they're really the issue, but where we can provide data that shows that ridership will be there, and that the Federal Transit Administration isn't going to fund something that's not going to work. I just want to make sure that I feel very strongly, obviously, about Purple Line, and there are a lot of people that do. But I think, and again, I'll be blunt, White Bear Lake has been emboldened to try to stop this. The fact is, just as in other areas of the metro, there are people that are behind it that have a whole lot of money and think that they can get this stopped. And it's not based on the facts. And so I'm concerned that the Met Council will cave to what I think is false information, and talking about how you're going to destroy the Bruce Vento Trail. That's not going to happen. All these things that are really kind of a smokescreen in some cases, but legitimate questions that need to be answered in other places. I want to make sure that we have as strong of a case as possible. And I guess I'd like to know, first of all, what is happening with those? We know what the ridership has dropped down to. How are we applying that to the projections for Gold Line and Purple Line, because those are the two that are pretty close here, and getting that information out? And what are your thoughts on what's going to happen at Met Council? I mean, they haven't been in the thick of these things for quite a while, because I mean, the last time they were in the thick of things was a different Met Council, and that was for the Green Line, the fights that go on. So tell me what you think.
Yeah,
and I know that this is a workshop and everybody's listening to it, but you know what? I guess one of the things that that I have talked about is everybody has the right to their own opinion. They don't have the right to their own facts.
Yeah.
And if we don't give them facts, updated facts, they're going to twist what's there to their own advantage. And again, if you have the money to get it out there, your voice seems really loud, when in fact, I don't think that's the case.
Yeah.
I'm frustrated. Can you tell?
No, you're not alone. You're absolutely not alone. And Commissioner, I think that you've raised one of the more important points. And one of the things I keep coming back to is transit seems to be held to a different standard. I mean, we certainly saw volumes drop substantially on the roadway system, but no one thought that we should tear up county roads or even local roads because fewer people were riding them or were using them. And certainly there's a valid argument to be made to say, would we do that? Would we think about doing less on the roadway side because we think that the urban area has fundamentally changed in some significant way? The other thing is, to your point about models, the way that they're currently, the way that FTA is currently handling the modeling is they're still holding us to pre-COVID ridership numbers. And so we're still estimating based on that. Now, part of it is because there aren't a lot of examples, and I could bore you with a lot of details on how models are work if you really wanted. And maybe that's something to do over a cold beverage rather than this. But I think that the short version is that the models that are used to make traffic projections and are similar to what are used for transit projections. And fundamentally, they're based on a lot of history. And there isn't a lot of history for this type of thing. So it's hard to project. But I will say that in our conversations as a team with Met Council and Met Transit, they have been planning for ridership to recover sometime in the next 3 to 4 years, which is consistent with what has happened in other parts of the world where they have had a significant pandemic impact to transit ridership. How accurate that is, whether it's 3 years or 5 years, I honestly don't know. And there's certainly lots of steps that any number of us as partners can take to make sure that it recovers well. And those are things like encouraging housing where it's needed and economic development along some of the major transit corridors and continuing to support the value of transit. I think the other thing is that there is tremendous data. Met Transit, like many of the large state agencies, has a tremendous data source in its fleet. And so they've been able to provide us even daily numbers if we want them, but they've been able to track month by month, and they've been comparing back to 2019 and to 2020. And I will say that what we see on the ridership is that while it's not back, it's trending upward. And so the narrative of A, people are never going to use it, B, people are never going to go downtown, transit doesn't still perform a valuable function, I think is a little overstated and is not supported by any data, but for the folks who are sitting around a campfire and telling each other that they'll never use it. Those are my candid observations.
Yep.
I don't know that I can speak
Yep.
intelligently about what Met Council will do in that trying place of, would they want to say there isn't an approval process for you to follow, and so we're going to be in White Bear Lake anyway? I honestly can't speak to that, but I guess I would question the value of it, and I'm by no means saying that this is the right answer, but to me, the fundamental issue is, do you live on an island or not? And a community can say that they don't want things to change, but if everyone around them changes, they would be unique in history in saying that they are not going to change. Right. And in particular, Highway 61 is going to experience all kinds of issues without some form of transit. To me, you've done what you can with the road. Your next level up is to say, now I need to put more people in higher capacity vehicles because I can't make more go on Highway 61 without tearing up rows of housing or rows of businesses. Like you've kind of done what you can with the right of way on 61. And so what are you going to do so that people can continue to move around that area? You got to do something. And so transit's the answer.
Well, and I do hope, just as a follow-up to this, I do hope that the Metropolitan Council understands either they believe in the numbers and what the Federal Transit Administration has done, or they don't. And, you know, we've, as counties, I guess I should say, and municipalities along this line have, I think, really stood strong, been flexible as far as moving, you know, stations and different things like that. And there's still a lot of decisions to be made. But in this handoff, you know, we've taken all the heat. And I just would really like to know that they're going to stand by the data just as we have been told to stand by it. So whatever we can do, and I don't know what that is, but I just feel very strongly about the fact that we need to, again, either we believe in the data or we don't. And if we don't, then we should be doing a whole bunch of different things. I believe in the data. I believe in the facts that have been presented. And I hope that the powers that be, as this moves forward, will really look at that and say, that's what this is about. Thank you.
Yep, good. Thank you, Victoria. Ryan, you got some comments on the topic here? I see your hand up.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Brian hit on it a little bit. I just want to really hammer this point. Traffic volumes were down the exact same amount as transit ridership. And yet we talk about one and not the other. And one, we talk about changing the way we now plan, design, build, and think for the future. With the other, we don't. I sent the traffic report in the chat box here in case someone wants access to it from MnDOT. And this is a constant thing that in a number of fronts this happens. You know, people say crime is up. It is. So is mental health crises at the same time. So are traffic related deaths as a share of overall trips. Like COVID has fundamentally shaped many areas. And I think it's incumbent upon us to continue to broaden the conversation back to, it's not just Ramsey County. It's not just one city. It's not even just the state of Minnesota. It's often a bigger thing than that. And there are many times when we cherry pick what changed, when really it seems as though most things around us have gone through a fundamental shift during a very disquieting time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thanks. And Victoria, I'll just add a couple things here, you know, being involved and being a part of this for the last 20 years and helping thread the needle on the Green Line and Union Depot and regional transit funding. This isn't new. These arguments have been there. I can remember in the early days of Gold Line, and folks were following us around to community meetings with their signs and you know, their own data, right? And their own emotions about how they felt about things. You know, I do believe strongly that, you know, strong, committed champions that continue to advocate for our communities that don't always have the voice to advocate for will prevail. It's hard to find people that will say they were against the Green Line. And there was an awful lot of stuff going on. Tony, Raphael, Victoria, you lived it, you were there. But I mean, the fact is the success and the value to that community has paid off. And so this isn't new. I do think your concern about Met Council is valid, especially as you make the transition here to the Met Council. And I do think there's value in you reaching out to Chair Zelli and just having a conversation with you and Chair Zelli about, you know, how do we ensure that the Purple Line is fully implemented and moving forward with the Met Council support here, recognizing that we've got a strong partner in Ramsey County, not only for funding, but being a champion out in the community. And, you know, Trista referenced it earlier, these investments aren't just, you know, chicken investments, right? They're egg investments, and we're doing it together and we're building for the future. That's why these take so long. So I feel your pain, I see it, but you know, we're here to help support you as the lead and the point person on this line. But I would suggest the timing for at least a conversation between you and Chair Zelli probably is about right on this line, so that you two can talk about, you know, the near future on how to move that project and ensure that that project is a part of the Met Council plan. I hope that's helpful. Let's see. I got Commissioner McGuire. Hi, waving that, saying hi to me.
I know. I'm waving. I'm waving at you. Well, my internet connection has been unstable. I'm not sure what that's about. So I've been going in and out, and I didn't know if you saw my hand still raised, so I was waving. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just really appreciate all of this conversation. I feel like I've been in a few meetings where they've actually, you know, they talked about the numbers, and yes, they've changed due to COVID, you know, less ridership in the morning, maybe not as minimal in the afternoon, but then maybe on weekends it's more, you know. So I've seen some studies where the ridership is sort of morphing. And I just think we ought to, for all the reasons that everyone has been saying, we need to stay, obviously we are all strong on our advocacy for transit. I just want to repeat what Commissioner Mattis Castillo said too about, you know, we just had our legislative committee meeting, and you know, we want to, maybe we need to lead on this, or I don't know, at the state or federal level, but these formulas that we're using for speed limits, for transit studies, you know, they seem like they're outdated. And I know this is a huge lift, and it can't be just because we want it. It would have to probably come from some associations, but I do want to say that I think we should keep that conversation going, that we shouldn't accept these outdated formulas. I agree with Commissioner Reinhardt. I want to follow the data, but what we do with it is what I'm concerned about, is that, you know, if we use it in formulas that are outdated, I think that doesn't serve us well. So I'm just going to repeat and concur with my colleagues who are wise in all of these areas, that I am going to be leery of any, you know, decisions we need to make based on these, on what we've done in the past, that we just need to move forward. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that.
Yep. I did want to bring in one more comment here, because these are complex issues, but I mean, things change all the time. When we started the Green Line, we couldn't even count transit dependent individuals, because the FTA assumed their needs were already being met. By the time we built the Green Line, you counted them twice because of the importance that these investments had and the impact it had on their lives. So things are always adjusting, things are always changing. To a couple of commissioners have already raised this. You know, being a part of AMC and NACO is really important, because for these bigger changes, you need those state and national voices and helping to influence those types of things. You know, we're fortunate. This administration is very supportive of transit investments. The infrastructure bill has a lot of transit money in there, which provides some opportunities moving forward, but also in how the FTA looks at and advances these lines have changed and evolved over the years. And sometimes, depending on the administration, they've made it harder. And sometimes, depending on the administration, they've made it easier. And I think, you know, one of the encouraging things right now is we know, at least for the next few years, we've got an administration that sees the value in these investments. So I think, you know, Commissioner Reinhardt, back to you and your concern about the Purple Line, you know, a conversation with Chair of Met Council about how do we not miss this opportunity with this administration to drive the Purple Line as far as we can towards that moment in time when, you know, we can feel much more comfortable that that line is going to be on the trajectory of, say, like the gold line, where we're at 100% engineering. So it's always changing. It takes a champion. As you know, you're one of the champions for that line. And as I said, we want to be supportive, because it can wear on champions, especially the community can wear champions down. So thanks for your work on that. Ryan, I think you might have a question or wanted to weigh in on something here. I'll call on you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. If there wasn't time, I wasn't going to worry. Brian, I could ask you this after, but I bet I'm not the only one. And with all the new infrastructure stuff passing, I don't have a good handle on all the dynamics yet. So my question is, does the new infrastructure bill, do you even know at this point, impact small starts, new starts, designations of programs in a good or bad way for the county? Or is it just too early to know? I'm kind of curious, and I figured since we're all on, I could ask you now.
Absolutely. I will say a little bit is known right now. One of the things that has come up is that, as an example, you raise small starts. So small starts is a little bit of a simpler program than the ones that we've been in, and they tend to be, as the name entails, smaller. What they've done is they've capped the federal amount with the new bill, but they've raised the cap for the overall project. So it used to be you had to be under $300 million to be able to qualify for small starts. Now it's up to 400.
Okay.
So if we had slightly smaller projects, then that would fit. And so it's those kinds of things. The other thing I'd emphasize, what I'm hearing, and this hasn't been necessarily through the bill, but I'm sure that it'll play itself out in the bill, is that equity continues to be a huge component of how the federal government is looking at spending federal dollars. And so we've had some initial conversations about some of the possibilities that could come from this with our friends at MnDOT and Met Council. I don't know that I know exactly how the transit funds are gonna play themselves out. I can speak more intelligently probably about how the highway side would play out, that they'll have more ability to support some things on the highway system and on what would call the federally eligible highway system, which would include some of our roads as well as others.
Thanks, Brian.
Where you'd see increases in bridge funding and those kinds of things, which would then help overall infrastructure spending. It would ease the burden a little bit.
That's super helpful. And Mr. Chair, we'll incorporate all of this stuff into the conversation we had this morning during the workshop, during the legislative one about plans going forward and how to think about advocacy when and where.
Perfect. I was thinking the same thing. So thank you, Ryan. All right. I don't see any more hands raised. I'm going to just pause for one moment if anybody's got a burning question or comment. Otherwise, I will turn it back over to Joanna, Brian, for any closing comments here. And thanks to George for all the work you do on with your sharp pencil and making sure that we can, whoever who sits in my chair and Victoria's chair and Raphael's chair and Nicole's chair in 1958 or 2058, we'll be able to celebrate as we're debt free on our investments for all our lives. So.
Yeah, you're all going to need to be there for the ribbon for the bond, the bond council. Unfortunately,
Stay healthy, everyone. Yeah.
Any closing comments here, Brian or Joanna?
I just want to say thank you, commissioners, for your ongoing support, and to the Public Works team for all, and to George, our controller, for the extremely hard work in this place. This is long-term planning. It requires a lot of tenacity and really a long view, as you all know very well. And we just have the utmost admiration for our team that's working in this space. So I just want to close my piece by saying thank you to everybody. And Brian, anything you want to add?
No, just that as you illustrated, thanks for the support. Thanks for the continuing long view. That really is helpful. And thanks to the team again, that they've done remarkable work. And to Commissioner McDonough's point, George's sharp pencil keeps us in the right place, which is always great. We're always grateful for that. So thanks again for the time.
Right.
Always good to see you.
Great. All right,
Thank
we're
you.
adjourned. Thank you. Good meeting. Take care.
Great meeting. Good job, Jim.